Okay, so where we're at now, it's been 2 days, and I took the plastic bag off after soaking it down with the mineral spirits like I said, and it's dry, but on the inside it's still damp, and on the outside I can feel it's still real cool. There's no cracks anywhere on here. And so now the next step is we'll start the sanding. I'm letting it dry out a little bit more. You could sand it right now, you could wet sand it, lots of different options. I could even dry sand this, it's probably dry enough on the outside. Now, I'm going to start, like I said previously, I'll start with 150 grit because of feeling it and looking at it, that's what I can determine I think is going to work. Now, I would tell you down at the dollar store, pick yourself up a pair of reading glasses, maybe 2 times or 2.5 times for $1. And I wear them and I look at this wood grain and I turn it slowly all the way around. And it tells me if there's any really bad imperfections or anything I need to be aware of. So it's a little tip, and it only costs you $1. I also take this hex wrench and I make sure it stays good and tight because it will shrink as it starts to dry. It won't shrink that fast, but it will. Okay, and I felt this all the way on the inside and on the outside. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll shut the camera off, but what I use is I use a drill. It has a pad on it that holds sandpaper and these little round discs. You can get them off Amazon. I'll leave you the links below. You can get them in all different grits. So I'll start power sanding this starting at 150 and we'll keep moving our way through the grits. Now if I have to stop and I have to let this sit for another day or 2 or 3 because of work, I'll spritz this down again just with mineral spirits and get it damp. Put the bag back over it. Now this is a process that works for me. So let me go ahead, I'll start with, like I said, with the 150. Then between each grit, I've got a blow gun, I blow it off and I use a rag and I wipe it and I get it clean and then I go on to the next grit. Each time I make that change, I put on those reading glasses and I look to make sure I get out all the previous grits scratches. Little time consuming, but the difference between an outstanding finish and a mediocre one is just a little more time. And I find the preparation stage is what's going to really help you to get an outstanding finish. So, okay, now there were questions regarding the hollowing rig. Now I bought mine from a place called Monster Tools. I don't think they're in business anymore, but let me show it to you real quick. Okay, so there's plenty of them for sale online everywhere else, and this one has been abused pretty good, right? I got my AA battery box here. This powers the little laser right here that shoots a little beam down. And I can put my hand here and I can tell how far I am away from the cutter on this, you know, when I'm hollowing. Or you can use a piece of paper or something, set it right here, and that laser will tell you the thickness. Now these are teardrop cutters. One's got kind of a little point up here. This one's rounded. I use this one for doing the pointy tip for a lot of the hogging out, and I use the round one for more smoothing out the inside. I can get it pretty darn smooth by taking light cuts. And if the wood's real dry and I'm having difficulty, I can spray, you know, some mineral spirits in there or something like that and get the wood kind of not soaking wet, but I get it good and damp and it cuts a lot cleaner. But this is a fairly fresh cut down tree, so I don't need to do that. But anyway, this is the hollowing rig. It's fixed to the lathe, comes right across the tool rest right here. I get it up close and I start hollowing. Now I start my hollowing from up at the mouth. You know, you've drilled that hole all the way down through here. Then I start with the hollowing and I start taking it out in pieces starting from the top, just coming all the way down. I get my wall thickness, 1/8 of an inch or whatever I want, and I just keep coming all the way down like this. And when I get to the bottom, I change this over and I go ahead and I clean up the bottom of it and make it nice and flat. And that's pretty much all there is to this hollowing rig. Now, there's more to the technique and there's more to practicing and getting skilled at using it, but I wanted to show it to you because we hadn't talked about it in too much depth earlier. Okay, I'm going to do the sanding. I'm going to go all the way up to 320, then I'll be back with you. Now, if you're wondering about the top, it's right here. There's the tenon. And this piece we'll work on later. So I put some anchor seal kind of material on both sides. It'll slow down, stop the cracking, but that's what I've done with this so far. And there it is. And it's ready to make a top. We'll do that in a little bit later. So I wanted to stop and talk about sanding for a second. Kind of a boring topic, but it's kind of important that you prepare things the best you can before you start the finish. So I started with 150, and if I drew a line in the middle, you can see I'm just below that halfway line with power sanding, and I'm moving it, you know, back and forth, and I'm getting the surface sanded down. Now, I run the lathe at probably right around 500 RPMs, maybe a little less, and I have a variable speed drill. You don't need the variable speed drill, but take your time when you're sanding, because you want to get out all the tool marks and imperfections that you can. So I take my time with that 150. You saw me power sanding. Then I'll stop. I'll blow this off. I'll wipe it down. I got my glasses on. I look for any of the previous sanding marks. If I was to use, like, let's say 80, and then I went to 120 or 150. But I look at it real close, because with this more coarse grit, we'll say that 150, I want to get out all the marks that I can and get it as smooth as I can. Blow it off, wipe it down, and now I'm ready to go on to 220. Now, there's debate here on where you want to stop before you worry about your finish. Now, I'm going to tell you, for me personally, it depends on what I'm going to put on here for a finish. Now, for this one, I'm going to use a wipe-on poly, and we'll get to that later on. But let's say it was going to be an oil finish. If it was an oil finish, I would probably go into much, much higher grits, and I would probably wet sand. In this case, because it's a film finish that's going to go on here, you'll have a lot of guys tell you you can stop at 150 because it's a film finish. It's going to go over, it'll fill in, and everything will look great. Well, that's true to a point. But on my film finishes, I always go to 220 and most of the time 320. So it's all dependent on you. Now, once I get to 220, by using the power sanding, what I'll do is I start between those higher grits now. I'll start hand sanding and going with the grain. And then I move on to the last couple of grits. Now, that's the way I do it. It works for me. I know other people will do it differently, and that's up to you. And when I'm power sanding, I don't push hard with that disc. Now, if you take a look at this drill, this disc right here, it has a pad on it right up in here. It's a pad. And I have the sanding disc itself right here. I don't push on this thing hard. I let the sanding paper do its job, and I push lightly as I'm going back and forth, and I'm sanding. So I like these padded ones. I don't like the ones that are real rigid, real hard and stiff. Now, that's my preference, but again, it's up to you and depends on what you have. Some people I know hand sand totally this whole thing. They'll use the power of the lathe, and they use sandpaper flat, and they sand this by the rotation, and they do it by hand. I like to power sand up to those last couple of final grits, but that's me. Everybody's different. The other thing I'm going to tell you is I always use good quality sandpaper, and I'll leave you some links below. I don't use cheap garnet paper or, you know, kind of crappy paper you might get from Harbor Freight in some of these places. I have used it in the past, but you go through it, I mean, so quickly, because the sandpaper is a poor quality and it dulls out fast. So I use good quality sandpaper. I use it, and I go through those kind of on the quick side too, because if you stop and think, you know, if you have worn out sandpaper, that tool is not cutting the wood like it should. So, you know, dull 150 sandpaper doesn't make it 220, right? So I use it, and I feel the sandpaper occasionally, and you'll get the feel for it. And if I feel it's getting dull, I throw it out, I put something new on there, and I keep going. All right, so let's recap one more time. I'm going to power sand like you saw me doing. I'll shut the camera off, and then when we get into the very higher grits, I actually hand sand, you know, with the grain. In this case, we're going to put a film finish. We'll do another video, or we'll talk about oil finishes later on. There are many different ways to finish wood projects. So for this one, because I really like the wood itself, it's got a lot of character in it, I'm going to stick with something I think that looks real nice, and I think the wipe-on poly will work really well on this. And you can build up coats too, but we'll get into all that. Okay, I'll see you in just a bit. Let me do all the sanding and we'll go on from there. Okay, a couple of comments I forgot I wanted to make. Now when I get to 220 and 320, I will sand both forward and reverse. I also will dampen the wood. I dampen it just to raise the wood grain, and I let it dry. I let it flash dry. It dries real quickly. I just barely get it wet. I spin it. It dries, the grain rises, and I keep sanding. But I do forward and reverse from 220 to 320, and that's what I'm doing. Now the other thing that I do, now that I'm that far along and I know this is what it's going to look like when we're done, is right here I create, instead of a sharp edge, I come in, this is called a Bedan. It's got a flat face to it. It's one of the Harbor Freight tools. I reground it, repurposed it. And I'll turn around and I come in just like this. And I take off very gently that sharp edge. Now, because I'm sanding at 150 and I'm about ready to finish this and do 220, I have my whole project on the same sanding protocol, which is, 220, 150, 220. And so here I have, instead of that sharp edge, like I said, I've got a nice kind of curved in edge, which I like better in terms of a look. Okay, I'll be back with you here when I finish the sanding.